From the Australian National University College of Law, this is Law and Crisis, bringing you interdisciplinary perspectives on the questions we're confronting today that will shape our future. In this episode, Professor Desmond Manderson discusses COVID-19, law and race with Professor Carolyn Strange.
I'm joined today by Professor Carolyn Strange, and Carolyn is a professor in the School of History in the College of Arts and Social Sciences, and she teaches interdisciplinary courses across a range of areas, including a strong interest in legal history and histories of criminal justice. But Carolyn, I wanted to talk to you about something specific today. I mean, I think I'm paraphrasing Lady Bracknell, who said something like, to be caught in one epidemic might be regarded as a misfortune, but to be caught in two looks like carelessness.
Well, I carelessly moved to Australia a year after SARS struck Toronto when I was teaching at the University of Toronto. And that university is located right in the heart of the city, a city of over 3 million people, a city that also had not just one, but several vibrant Chinatowns, as they were known to locals. And these became very quickly ghost towns in 2003 when SARS struck Toronto, killing over 40 people over the course of about a month in March of 2003.
So you were there, and what was that experience? Firstly, what was it like being there? And
well, I also lived downtown at the time, and it was something akin to what we see now, but it was not as a result of any local government crackdown on people being out and about, but rather the impact of the WHO's travel advisory against traveling to Toronto. So this was an externally imposed travel advisory that really took local government by surprise. It was an example of supranational governance, and it included Toronto in unfamiliar ways with prohibited travel zones that were primarily in China and Southeast Asia.
So this was a shock to Toronto's self-image in lots of ways.
Absolutely, yes. And so Toronto was until the early 60s, quite a monocultural city, certainly compared to Montreal, where you've lived. So it was overwhelmingly Anglo, overwhelmingly white. As a result of changes in immigration policies in the 1970s, it rapidly became, and remarkably became, the most ethnically diverse city in the world. So it was more ethnically diverse by the early 2000s than places we usually associate with that, such as New York City or London. So it was a way in which that multicultural identity flipped from being an asset to a detriment.
So in the your article that you wrote about your experience of the SARS 2003 epidemic, you describe it as a postmodern public health crisis. So what do you mean by that? What was postmodern about it?
Well, I think one of the key features of modernity was the nation state as and its search for sovereignty over its borders. It was postmodern in the sense of having the indeterminacy of its borders determined by an external force, but also not just the WHO in terms of imposing governance over it. And remember, this was not about Canada, this was about one city. So it was also, the porosity was demonstrated by the patient zero who came from Hong Kong. She was a permanent resident. She was identified by the media, which was a real violation of privacy. And it was also a mediatized event. So it wasn't so much what we're seeing now, where we've got Scott Morrison or various public health officers telling us what we should and shouldn't do. It was the international media's attention to this travel advisory that made Toronto a no-go zone. And again, we're talking about a major metropolis. So it was, I don't know if there's a specific definition of what would constitute a postmodern public health crisis, but those are the reasons why I
also the way
asserted it was.
Right. But also, I suppose you were talking about the way in which it was on one level a public health, a serious public health issue, but it was also about the way in which it was a media problem and an image problem, right? As well as being, or perhaps in some ways more than, it was a public health problem. But all of that brings me, I think, to something that I really wanted to hear you talk a bit about, and that is the question of race. And I suppose my question is, how did ideas and tropes of race play out in Toronto in SARS 2003?
Well, as I mentioned, Toronto was, until a few decades before the SARS crisis, an overwhelmingly monocultural city, but it was never, absolutely monocultural. There had been, despite Chinese exclusion laws that were passed, national laws in the early 20th century, primarily in the 1920s, but head taxes against Chinese people specifically from the 1880s, there were historic associations between people, particularly from China, not just Asian people broadly, but from China, who had come to Canada to build railroads, to establish businesses, to define them as not being appropriate for the national body of Canada, of white hegemonic Canada.
That was true in Australia too, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, it was true in most, white settler countries as well as some parts of Europe. So what happens when you get, especially the issue of the source of the disease coming from China, it reactivated that kind of association between Chineseness and dangerousness. And it's what's interesting about some of those exclusion laws that were expressly race-based. They referred to the association of peoples from certain parts of the world with loathsome diseases. So that term was used. So terms like moral turpitude and loathsomeness are terms of disgust and separation, of not belonging. But of course, there were Chinese people in Toronto from the early 19th century. So there had been Chinatowns in Toronto all the way through. So it wasn't as if there hadn't been incorporation largely to flag its multicultural flair. So suddenly the flair became a flashpoint of racism.
Right. And what was interesting to me was I guess in some ways, when you talk about how this kind of racist language about Chinese people, about outsiders, about the danger they pose to the body politic, about pollution and all of that stuff, which we've seen in the 19th century, suddenly showing this resilience, right? And that when push comes to shove, diversity is all very well, but these people are outsiders and they're dangers and they're not us. And it was really the power of those racial stereotypes to be, in your words, reanimated, right? To be sort of revived. In another part in your essay, you use a rather lovely phrase when you say it ignited an existing store of underlying associations of race and East and disease. And just, and even being applied, it didn't matter whether these terms were now being applied to Chinese people in Toronto or to white Torontonians or to Canadians. It was the power of the signification as opposed to the persons that they may or may not have been applied to. It's like that language, like those stereotypes had a life of their own. And were not so easily killed or repressed.
No, and the way you put it, a life of their own, they jump around. They're absolutely full of beans, and that was the real issue. It wasn't just reanimating or reigniting that store of racism and racist associations, but it was also what was a visceral reaction among white Torontonians was the sense of everyone else now thinks of us as the same. We're in the same Eastern exotic category.
Yeah.
So it was, I have to say, it was rather weird to be sitting in Toronto and hear, don't go to Guangzhou, don't go to Taipei, don't go to Hanoi, and don't go to Toronto.
And I guess I just wanted at this point to step out a little bit to bring in, a deeper history, right? Which of course you're also extremely familiar with, and that is the relationship between disease and colonization, the way in which race and disease and colonization have always been part of the same story, right?
Mm-hmm. But not always in ways we think of. Of course, because Indigenous peoples in places that were invaded by Europeans didn't have resistance to diseases that Europeans had become more familiar with. They had more herd immunity. Were devastating. These encounters were devastating on a mass scale. But on the other hand, when you've got Europeans running around all over the earth colonizing, they are also vulnerable to diseases that Indigenous people had become resistant to. So, for instance, you've got the experience of French soldiers trying to put down the Haitian rebellion and dying in droves of yellow fever, which the local Haitians had developed some resistance to. So again, there's a double-edged sword with that kind of movement of peoples in the course of colonization. But of course, the equation, falls much more heavily on Indigenous people.
Right. So we can see, colonization is the prehistory of globalization.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's related to the movement of peoples and the movement of diseases and all of those things. And then, as you point out, there is this double-edged nature to the story of disease, but there's also this incredible cruel irony where Europeans, in relation to Aboriginal people in Australia or in Canada for that matter, bring the diseases that decimate the population and at the same time talk about the dirty, diseased, polluted Aboriginal people or Chinese people as a basis for those racist laws, right, that form the structure of this sort of sheltered, protected settler colonial society. And it's the way in which those stereotypes about pollution and disease lead to specific legal responses, right? And you mentioned both in Canada and in Australia, the Asian Immigration Acts, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, or in places like Western Australia, for example, where the laws prohibiting Aboriginal people from moving down into places like Perth were called the leprosy line because it was supposed or alleged that Aboriginal people were carriers of leprosy and they would bring the leprosy to the settled parts of the country.
You can see this even more starkly in terms of leprosy in the case of Hawaii, where it was overwhelmingly, after 1865, Indigenous Hawaiians who were sent to Molokai to what was called a leper colony, simply if they were thought to be suffering or they were members of families who were suffering from leprosy, these were sanctions that were far greater than any criminal sanctions because effectively they were sent there to die. So even the convicts who were sent from the British Isles to Australia, the assumption was that they weren't being sent to die, they were being sent to work and to possibly earn their release. So you can see that for biomedical reasons, the coercive powers of states have fallen overwhelmingly in terms of Indigenous peoples, but also consigning them to death.
I mean, that's a great point about the the way in which these things create coercive legal responses. So on the one hand, the rhetoric is a kind of legitimating rhetoric of colonial power and so on, but it also has very specific legal implications. And the language of disease is implicated in those legal responses. I mean, if you look at the Australian Constitution, the two laws that were thought to be, two of the most important laws for the Commonwealth Government in 1900 were, one, the immigration power, the race power, and two, the quarantine power.
Mm-hmm.
Quarantine seems to be almost like an enduring Australian fantasy, Carolyn.
Well, I think it's particularly associated with the concept of the island nation, that we are girt by sea, as our national tune says. There aren't too many other countries, I think, that have that in their anthem. Maybe there are, but it does play on the idea that was prevalent at the moment of Confederation, and this is always what historians obsess about. What meaning does it have at that specific moment? Why do certain things come together at that specific juncture? So yes, the concept of White Australia in the midst of effectively Pacific Islanders and Southeast Asia, the whiteness of this place was significant and protected by quarantine, and the capacity to quarantine when you're an island nation, unless you're letting people off cruise ships, is right. Stronger than in places with land borders that are impossible to police.
So, I mean, practically there is this idea about quarantine and separation and border and security and all of those sorts of things, right? There's this geographical kind of promise in Australia, but there is also this kind of powerful rhetorical pull to insularity, right? And insularity going back to insular and island, right?
Mm-hmm,
So that I guess the language and the anxiety is almost overdetermined in a place like Australia, isn't it?
But again, think back to Hawaii. So that it's the Hawaiian Islands. So they pick a particular peninsula on one small island that was not particularly suited to agriculture, and so it was an expendable place. It's the Christmas Island. It's the Nauru of its time.
Yeah, and in Australia, in Tasmania, for example, they round up all the Aboriginal people, the usual suspects,
mm-hmm.
and they send them to a little peninsula, basically, as you say, to die.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called Point Civilization. That little place is called Point Civilization.
Well, I think it's really appropriately named, especially with point being in its compound name, that it's the pointy end of civilization in Western terms.
That's a great point on which to finish. I want to thank you very much for the chat.
It's a pleasure.
And particularly for placing the context we're in now in relation to a history that you lived through 20 years ago and a history...
not quite. I'm not quite that. It's 17.
History, I stand corrected.
Yes, that's right.
A very few years ago, and a longer history. And I think the great thing about history as a discipline is to put both our psychological, our health, and our legal responses into this longer context, and to see the continuities and the differences.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to share that experience and to speak with you about it, Des.
Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome.
If you're enjoying Law and Crisis, make sure you also check out International Law and COVID-19, a new collection of essays by our scholars as they explore what the public health crisis means for human rights, trade, security, and much more. Discover it today at law.anu.edu.au.